Welcome to all our listeners. Ubuntunomics is a weekly roundup and discussion of the most important economic and political developments from Africa. Hosted by myself, Sia from PESA. PESA is a political economy think tank that promotes regional integration in SADC and provides research on the political economy of development in Africa. With me is my co-host, Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Isakombe Assets provides individuals with renewable energy assets in order to develop communities. Hello, Sbu. How are you today?
No, fine. Thank you, Sia. How are you? How are things today?
No, I'm very well. Thank you very much. What do you have for us in store from South Africa this week?
From South Africa, my first story is the IFC to support affordable student housing. The International Finance Corporation announced a 150 million rand equity investment in a platform to develop and operate affordable rental accommodation for up to 15,000 students over the next 5 years. The platform will be managed by South Africa's Aris Property Group. The IFC also committed to helping Aris raise additional funds from other parties in order to fully subscribe a targeted 2 billion rand capital raise. According to the IFC, there is currently a shortage of about 500,000 beds for students at universities and vocational training schools.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's interesting.
that's my first story.
Sure.
Our second story today is on the roadmap for full electrical vehicle strategy. The Department of Trade, Industry and Competition took first steps by releasing a green paper inviting substantive comments from all stakeholders, including members of the public. The aim is to establish a clear policy foundation, a long-term strategy to position South Africa at the forefront of advanced new energy vehicles and electric vehicle component manufacturing. To achieve a competitive edge in the global race, the strategy will focus on the creation of a high-yielding business environment, an appropriate fiscal and regulatory framework, investment in new energy vehicle component technology, expansion of the fledgling electric supply chain, transition of South Africa towards cleaner fuel technologies, then a targeted research and development investment, and the upskilling of our workforce.
I have so many questions on this one. Also, partly mainly because, I did my master's on the automotive sector and how government is supporting local production. So tell me, does the green paper include any additional incentives which are targeted at electric vehicles?
Yeah, it's still early days, but the green paper does talk about a market stimulus and supply chain support measures, an investment and a tech system that helps build a resilient raw material supply chain to turn South Africa into a global player. Now, industry has suggested that National Treasury reduce the ad valorem duty. Now, the ad valorem duty is for motor vehicles, electronic equipment, cosmetics, perfumes, and products that are generally regarded as luxury items and are subject to the payment of ad valorem excise duties if those items are used within the Southern African Customs Union, SACU. Now, another consideration is that a standard rate per kilowatt could be used. like the industry suggests an average rate for the year 2020 of $137 per kilowatt to reduce the price of an EV, of an electric vehicle, in aligning it to be closer to the price of an internal combustion engine vehicle for a period of say 5 years. That is, they hope that will stimulate demand for these EVs. I mean, like in places like China used a similar model where it is basically the incentives that have driven demand. But lately, uh, customers have picked up on this trend with the arrival of Telsa. Um, anyway, let me coming back to South Africa. Government has also noted that the need to synchronize such reforms with active localization of production would be helpful. In this way, the ad valorem tax could be used as the instrument to tackle the demand side once again. This must be balanced, though, with the need for Treasury to maintain a targeted tax collection from the ad valorem tax, which may require a restructuring of the tax system. With one option being considered, option being considered is to lower taxes on EVs balanced against higher tax levels for luxury vehicles over a certain price. So it's all about trying to lower the price of EVs so that
I
there's
think sure. I think it's a good approach, I guess, if you want to stimulate demand. But my biggest issue is this, and this is basically my view on the strategy. I think firstly, we need to deal with the electricity supply shortage challenge we have already, right? We are a nation that has only received their first Tesla this month, and at the same time, we're still faced with rolling blackouts, and we've just heard now that a stage 2 is expected to, in terms of load shedding, is expected to be the norm throughout this winter. So I don't think that the strategy of trying to convert our local production for EVs, at least if it's going to be for South Africans to buy those electric vehicles, I don't think that it's going to be a sustainable strategy without resolving the supply challenges. Secondly, we still produce way too low volumes in terms of any kind of switching completely from your internal combustion engine to producing purely electric vehicles. South African production of automotive vehicles, in terms of our contribution to the global production, is less than 0.05%, so less than 1%. Like NAMSA, for example, the Association of Automotive Producers, with the Automotive Industry Development Plan, which was extended after it was supposed to run from 2015 to 2020 as the first round, and has been extended to 2025, was targeting a reach of 1%. The problem with that is our volumes are too small, and we cannot benefit from economies of scale. And as a result, we struggle to compete on price with other sources of production, such as Brazil or even Southeast Asia, Thailand, etc., who are producing way bigger volumes and at lower prices than we can, purely on the back of the economies of scale. And then I think lastly is the issue around, the impact of our industrial policy on the SACU region. I'm not sure how well the SACU partners are going to take this, because whatever reductions or changes in our excise duties or ad valorem tax is definitely going to impact what is collected in the common revenue pool, right? And already the automotive industry industrial policy incentives have been a point of contention amongst the SACU member countries, precisely because South Africa is stimulating its industry, but at the same time taking away money that could be shared amongst the SACU member states. And that only benefits South Africa in terms of the industrial policy. And I think lastly is I'm not saying this is a terrible, terrible plan or that it'll never work, but they've got significant challenges to face. But I must commend that any kind of productive capacity in electric vehicles in South Africa does present an opportunity for the region to connect to that value chain. For example, we already have leather and vehicle trim producers from Lesotho who are producing for the South African automotive industry in terms of seat covers and internal trim for vehicles. Then, in terms of batteries and storage, we've got the DRC, which has got rich minerals that are core for this precise, usage, but obviously is facing challenges of internal conflicts, etc. So I do think that the production of electric vehicles in South Africa does present a huge opportunity for the region to connect and plug into that, but we still face some significant obstacles. I think our roads are good enough, I think, but in terms of the infrastructure and electricity supply, we've got significant shortages. And then, the incentives that are targeting demand will only work if we're producing for South Africans to consume those vehicles. And at the same time, given the fact that we're only 60 million as a small population with high inequality, the demand is never going to make up for what producers need in order to produce locally. So that's why our automotive industry has always been export orientated. So it'll be interesting to see how this roadmap develops by way of export incentives rather than what they're currently conceiving in terms of demand or internally based demand incentives. But anyway, that's my 2 cents on this.
Also, to consider is our ideology, our philosophy, basically based on global geopolitics. Because why I'm saying this is that the minister Ibrahim Patel says is benchmarking South Africa based on the Europeans, on the UK and the Germans. The Germans there are a lot of plants, auto manufacturing plants here in South Africa, which are German.
Yeah.
But for EVs, the Germans are not global leaders in this new front.
Sure.
China sold last year more EVs than the whole of Europe combined.
Wow.
And the other thing that you have to consider are the batteries. 95% of these EV batteries are manufactured in South Korea and in China. So basically, we are looking the other way. We should be modeling the Chinese and the South Koreans and the Japanese. Not
the US or European model. Yeah. Don't come with the package, but I hear your point. I hear your point. Yeah, and I do think that those markets do present the new frontier in terms of electric vehicles. I think the European markets are limited by size at this point, and obviously they're also very well developed and have their own sources domestically. And I think they could definitely satisfy their internal demand from their own internal production within Europe, right? And that's what they've been doing. But I think what South Africa is trying to do is to keep up with some of the commitments that the multinational corporations have made. Recently, we've seen a number of the German automotive producers commit themselves in order to ensure that their production is completely electric vehicles by some as early as 2030. I don't think that it's going to be feasible. I don't think that things are going to move that fast, but it's going to be interesting to see how the sort of creative destruction of the internal combustion engine being replaced by electric vehicles is going to work. And I think at the same time, there are those who are criticizing electric vehicles and the sort of green revolution as a fad, in that they're saying that all these alternatives were being presented in terms of the green industries that we've seen, solar energy, as well as other renewable energies, are actually being questionable in terms of their real impact on the environment. I think where they don't contribute in terms of CO2 gases, they seem to have other alternative impacts that are, environmentally adverse for the environment. Such things such as, the impact of hydroelectricity supply. For example, this has been a big drive in SADC in terms of the rollout of energy supply in the region. Whereby it's seen as a better alternative than your original coal power plants, etc. But research is now suggesting that building up of dams in order to show up water for hydroelectricity generation has an adverse impact on the ecology as well as the environment downstream. So it's going to be an interesting way to see how the automotive industry, develops and transitions, and whether it's going to have its own just transition, so to speak.
Africa have a gun on their head because General Motors, for example, as you were saying, have pledged that by 2030 they will not be producing into any other cars, any other vehicles than electric vehicles. So South Africa, we just down the road in Port Elizabeth, we have a big plant manufacturing for GM. So it means that plant has to be altered to suit these new technologies. So we better start moving. So yeah.
Sure. But look, I think we must also understand the state of South African automotive production. I having done my research and know people who work in the sector, we are up there in terms of technology and production. I think in comparison to other sectors other regions that we compete with, such as South America or South Asia, our use of technology and the quality of production is right up there. And we've won many times, prestigious awards such as the J.D. Powers Awards, as well as the fact that major multinationals such as BMW have used South Africa as their base for producing some of their core models for the global environment completely. For example, the 3 Series, I think a couple of years back, was completely being produced in South Africa for the whole global market by BMW. Similarly to the current X3 and the current X5, if I'm not mistaken. So we're not lagging far behind. We definitely are there. And this has been the challenge, I think, for the industrial policy, in that government has been using incentives that incentivize capital investment in order to promote increasing local supply capacity. Yet at the same time, we must understand that technology is competing with labor, right? That the more we industrialize, the more we use capital equipment in our production, the less we need labor. And so there's been this trade-off, which government hasn't been able to deal with. But I think the positive out of that is that our production has really been able to keep up with global standards and quality.
Okay, now this story we will catch up with this. This is still the green paper, so the story will develop. Our next story coming out of South Africa is remarks by President Ramaphosa at the African Economies Funding Summit. At the African Economies Funding Summit held in Paris, President Cyril Ramaphosa said the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, estimates that sub-Saharan African economies will grow at the slow rate of 3.4%, even though we are buoyed by higher commodity prices in 2021. This is compared to the global growth of 6%. African governments need to mobilize significant additional external financing, he said, with the assistance of the international community. He said credit rating agencies need to play their role without acting as a deterrent to countries seeking credit relief measures. The IMF's special drawing rights mechanism should be allocated without delay to provide liquidity to the global financial system and to make a general allocation of $650 billion to meet the long-term need to supplement reserve assets. I think you've got a similar story.
Yeah. I was about to say we'll get into this a bit later, and I think this is one of the big stories of this week, actually.
Yes. So we will leave that to your African section. Our last story coming out of South Africa is the release of CPI data for the month of April 2021. Statistics South Africa, Stats SA, released the headline Consumer Price Index, the CPI, for the month of April 2021. Year-on-year headline CPI was 4.4% in April 2021, as compared to a 3% in April 2020. The Consumer Price Index increased by 0.7% month on month in April 2021. Main contributors were food and non-alcoholic beverages, which increased by 6.3% year on year and contributed 1.1 percentage points to the total CPI annual rate of 4.4% I mentioned earlier. Next is housing and utilities, which increased by 2.3% year on year and contributed 0.6 percentage points to the CPI. And transport increased by 10.6% year on year and contributed 1.5 percentage points to the 4.4% annual rate. Yeah.
That's a very interesting story, and I think if you remember us covering your story last month, actually, on the energy price increases, that we predicted this, as anybody else would have seen, obviously. But what are the main drivers for the household and utilities inflation?
Housing and utilities, electricity and fuels increased by 6% year on year. That's the major one. The second driver is water and other services, which increased by 6% year on year.
And there are those municipal tariffs, right? Sorry, the last one?
Municipal tariffs, yeah. And the last one is maintenance and repair, which increased by 4%. So
I think those top two speak to
municipal services,
yeah, electricity, the fuel levy, as well as municipal rates, which are increased. Wow. So I think we're definitely seeing the first round of those price increases affecting inflation. And if we're at now 4.4%, I think we're still relatively safe, but obviously we're now escalating from where we were at around 3%, if I'm not mistaken, as an average for last year's inflation.
Yes, it was 3%. And still, we haven't factored in the supply side constrictions, because what has happened is that food, as I said earlier, food and beverages have gone up considerably, and yeah.
And I think that's really the first round of impact, and which was going to actually link to my second questions to say, what are the drivers for the transport inflation you spoke about earlier?
I see where you're getting at. And then for transport, fuel increases increased by 21%. Fuel.
Wow. That's quite an interesting, and knowing that we only increased the fuel levy by a couple of cents, right? I think it was 20 or 40 cents. In any case, but we definitely are seeing the first round of those effects, and they're going to spread into other areas. Obviously, the food and transport and household and utilities are going to feel the pinch initially, because everyone is going to be consuming food, which is going to be increased as a result of higher logistics costs due to the fuel and energy costs, logistics and production, by the way. And then that's going to be felt also on the household's transport costs, despite the fact that we've got some travel restrictions, and I think most people aren't traveling as much as they normally would. But we definitely are seeing the impact of those tax increases on inflation here, and it'll be interesting to see what decision the Monetary Policy Committee of the South African Reserve Bank makes later this month, as they have to make an interest rate decision. I think it's next week, if I'm not mistaken.
They kept the repo rate at the same percentage.
Okay.
So there was no increase today. Yeah, there was no increase today.
I think that also reflects the fact that they're seeing inflation starting to rise up, but obviously not at alarming levels. And so that ends the interest rate downwards cycle that we were on.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying just now about running costs. Running costs for private transport increased by 8%, and public transport increased by 5%, and still we haven't factored in the effects of the third wave, which is starting in the Gauteng region, and because those will have a direct impact on your supply side.
Yeah.
So
Tough times ahead for South Africa.
Yeah, though that's the last story from South Africa. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sbu. I think on that note, let me take us through the Africa regional update for this week. Our first story this week is African Economies Funding Summit, which was held in Paris. The President of France, His Excellency Emmanuel Macron, hosted the Summit on Financing of African Economies at the Grand Palais Impérial Éphémère. Sorry, there's a bit of my French there, in Paris. The IMF estimates that an additional financing of up to 285 billion will be needed during the period from 2021 to 2025 for African countries to step up their spending response to the COVID-19 pandemic, with about half of it for African low-income countries. The summit ended with a collective call for a swift decision and implementation of a general allocation of IMF special drawing rights, SDRs, by 650 billion, which you mentioned earlier, Sbu, which is expected to increase the reserve assets of African countries by $33 billion. In addition, the summit called for voluntary on-lending of the SDRs to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, the PRGT, and building upon the ongoing review of the IMF concessional financing and policies. So the expectation is that countries who are advanced or have already accumulated strong foreign exchange reserves would be able to on-lend that to the PRGT, which would provide concessional funding to African countries. And the summit declaration was adopted by 30 African countries, including Belgium, Canada, China, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Portugal, Saudi Arabia, Spain, the United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, and the USA, who are also participants at the summit. And I think, sure, this is definitely a topical issue. Go ahead, Smooth.
Yeah, I don't have a question on this one, but it's my only point that I would like to make is that African countries are so obsessed with this with foreign lending, with foreign borrowings to build anything. Look at how you say that the reserve assets for African countries will increase by 33 billion. I mean, billion US dollars. South Africa needs to somehow find a way of financing its own development, not be constrained by all of this foreign debt. But anyway, that's a
Look, I totally understand your frustrations, Boo, and I must bring some. I think I must bring some perspective and also some calm. Firstly, we must understand that although commodity prices have increased, as we've seen in 2021, African firms are not necessarily, or African countries generally, are not necessarily benefiting from those higher prices. And this is largely because of a lot of mining operations which had to shut down during the COVID-19 global lockdown of 2020, right? That affected a number of mining operations across the continent which had to either shut down or liquidate because they just couldn't operate or they were bankrupt as a result of the lockdown or low commodity prices. So that's the starting point. And as a result of that, we're not actually earning the amount of foreign exchange reserves that we need. And as we've seen, African countries are generally struggling in terms of their response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as access to vaccines. And these are all expenses which require US dollars. Although I support you in terms of the obsession with foreign currency borrowings, I must admit that the needs we face now are actually linked to the current foreign exchange crisis that we're currently facing, of us not being able to take advantage of higher commodity prices, and at the same time, means that our mining and commodity exports, which by and large African countries rely on in many instances, are not actually producing at levels that they should be producing and not earning the dollars they should be earning. And so countries are finding themselves in a challenge and not being able to buy the vaccines or buy any capital equipment. And then I think there's the structural factor around African countries' dependence on foreign borrowing, because the political economy of commodity exporters is always going to lead you to balance of payments problems. This is a crisis that has been known for multiple of decades, hundreds of years. It's the same crisis that structural economists in South America were commenting about, and the failure of South America's import substitution strategies, that the process of substituting imports when you depend on commodity exports is always precarious, because you're not in control of commodity prices. The minute commodity prices collapse, you have a balance of payment crisis, which forces you to go and borrow from the IMF, which then puts you under an IMF program. And that program means you cannot respond from a government point of view in terms of supporting your economy during a time when the commodity prices are slumped. And so the very response you need to deal with the balance of payments problem is not possible given the IMF and their policies which require austerity, right? Because in the context of low commodity prices, you would need government to step up and support aggregate demand or support firms in order to keep them to survive the low commodity price slump until commodity prices recover again. And this is a recurring problem for countries that export commodities. And so your process of import substitution industrialization is always going to be undermined by this. And I think that's really the dilemma that most African countries face themselves in. I think also at the same time, it's also a perfect storm, right? In that here's a pandemic that we cannot shake off globally until we succeed at a global vaccination level, right? We cannot leave African countries behind as we've done in terms of industrialization and other development, whilst expecting to continue living the quality of life that people are living in the absence of Africa keeping up in many other ways, industrially, etc. So the pandemic has forced the advanced economies to assist, or at least within their frameworks of financial control, etc., to find ways to assist. For example, this increase in 650 billion SDRs is only benefiting African countries by a measly $33 billion, right? But that also speaks to the African countries' shareholding within the IMF as a starting point. So, there's all these structural levels which keep us where we are, which I think justifiably push you to be as frustrated as you are. But I think at this point, a lot more is going to be needed from advanced economies. I think I've said multiple times that we are at that moment we were in when the heavy indebted poor countries initiative started with the Paris Club back in the 1980s, right? Because We had high growth as a result of high commodity prices in the 60s and the 70s. And then when that collapsed, with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the 70s, which resulted in the depression and the recession of the 70s and the petrol crisis, African countries' growth slashed from 12% average over that decade, 1960 to 70, to a recession in the 80s. And so they couldn't actually recover because of the burden of public debt. African countries are in the same position now. It's happening in Zambia. It's happening in a number of other countries. It's happening in Zimbabwe. Been happening in Nigeria. It happened. In fact, if it had not been for the debt suspension initiative, a lot of countries would have defaulted the same way that Zambia did.
Exactly.
So what I'm trying to say is that, there is this dilemma which is forcing us to borrow in foreign currency, but at the same time, advanced economies are now forced to assist African countries to keep up. And I'm saying that that's created an opportunity for us to demand more by way of assistance in terms of debt restructuring, debt cancellations, because the current methods of just extending concessional debt to African countries is not going to work. Also, at this point, they've realized that the debt suspension initiative doesn't work. That's being expanded to the common framework, which is going to aim at restructuring both commercial as well as official in terms of public debt for African countries. But I think it needs to go beyond this. I think the only sustainable way is if countries grant African countries the TRIPS waiver in terms of industrial policy, a suspension on vaccines in order to enable us to produce these vaccines locally. And that to me doesn't just speak to the COVID-19 pandemic, but speaks to the preparedness of African countries for future pandemics. I think we're fortunate in that we have a pandemic that we can control through a extreme lockdown or through just the use of social distancing and masking. Other pandemics such as the Ebola virus, etc., which are highly infectious, are not going to be, as maintainable or as containable, and are going to continue spreading until African countries have got their own domestic capacity to produce vaccines, to monitor, as well as do their own lab research in order to respond to local variants of whatever kind of pandemic we face in future, including what we're faced with now in the COVID-19 pandemic. So for me, the lending is just really kicking the can down the road. That's what I view it.
And you haven't even mentioned that if the Ethiopian, the Tigray war. Ethiopia is one of those countries with a high growth rate, but it is highly indebted, and and another country would be Rwanda, which is also highly indebted in foreign currency, because all of that development was paid for by in foreign currency, in the US dollar. I mean, Africa needs to have financing institutions that are properly resourced. I don't think the African Development Bank is properly resourced at all. So we end up going back to our colonial masters, going back to Paris, to go with cap in hand, go beg them to finance our development.
Yeah, so, it's a permanent dilemma of African countries, but I think the process of relying on domestic capital for investment, which is the only sustainable way forward, is a slow process. It's a process of crossing the river by feeling the stones on the bottom of the riverbed. It cannot happen overnight, and I do encourage you. I am encouraged, by advancing the sort of new forms of financing, such as what we've seen in the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, which is now introducing a series of local currency bonds. They've issued a rupees bond in India. They've issued a renminbi bond, and I think there were talks of a rand-denominated bond that they were going to issue for South Africa. For me, the future really on sustainable African development lies in domestic capital, domestic currency bonds. But at the same time, what is more critical to me is that we need to spend that local capital on capital equipment that reduces our reliance on capital imports from the rest of the world. I'm quite at the same time. I'm quite disappointed by regions such as the Central and West African CFA regions, which even though they've had very how can I say, very enabling terms in terms of their exchange rate policy with the French National Treasury and the euro, a fixed exchange rate, have still not used that to import capital equipment and advance their own development using domestic currency. They're still far too reliant on issuing of euro bonds in order to finance their local development when they have a fixed exchange rate and unlimited convertibility. They should be using that in order to exchange their local CFA francs and import capital equipment so that they can increase their export earnings and move away from a reliance on commodity exports. But we haven't seen this. Obviously, the other challenge in these regions is the issue of conflict as well, which consistently undermines the continuity of development. And then I think where we are not being failed by dependence on imports from the rest of the world, we're being failed by conflict, which doesn't allow us to sustainably accumulate capital on the continent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we can talk till the cows come back home on this one.
But I think on a more positive note, our next story looks at the construction of the Sierra Leone and Liberia JPB, the Joint Border Post. And I think this is another critical big story in terms of the development of regional infrastructure, and also one of the ways in which Africa can develop itself by increasing intra-regional or intra-Africa trade. So the process of construction of a joint border post between Liberia and Sierra Leone has begun. The JBP will facilitate cross-border trade and the free movement of persons and goods along the Dakar-Abidjan corridor. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS Regional JBP program, aims to decongest and clear border posts currently blocked due to poor coordination and discordant procedures, manual controls, an ever-increasing number of border agencies, as well as unconnected national systems. The ECOWAS JBP's joint border posts operate similar to the one-stop border posts with traffic where traffic only stops once in each direction of travel. So you might remember a couple of weeks back we spoke about the one-stop border post being developed, in fact, last week at the Kazungula border post commissioning. This is a similar border post being constructed between Liberia and Sierra Leone in West Africa.
So sorry to spoil the party, but I have to go back to my question. Who funds the program? Is it from individual states or is it external sources?
I see where you're going against me. Look, I think so this project is being funded by two donor partners. And again, speaks to the dilemma of our integration process on the continent, in that it is still dependent on donor partners and development partners funding it. So this border post is being funded by the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, which funded the studies, the feasibility studies, and the ESG, the environmental, social, governance studies, and the EU is actually funding the actual construction of the border post, as well as the maintenance of the road leading up to this border post. So yeah, it is the two donors who are funding this project. Look, I think the issue of capital for development and finance for development in Africa is such a dilemma. And it also is linked. We cannot, unfortunately, separate ourselves from the colonial past. The fact of the matter is, a lot of capital was extracted from Africa in the form of natural resources without any investment in order to fuel the expansion of European industrialization as well as the Industrial Revolution. So even the fact that countries like Paris are leading the charge in terms of African finance is partly a bit of European guilt on the part that they've played in our underdevelopment as a continent. And it will always create this dilemma because the new forms of our integration in the global economy have actually promoted new forms of colonialism, neo-colonialism, in that we're still tied in as commodity exporters, etc. And it doesn't matter how much financing they can provide until African leaders do things like what the president of Ghana, Nana, has done in terms of cancelling all cocoa exports to European countries and saying, we're going to produce the chocolate locally and export that to the rest of the world. We're not going to go any further. Obviously, this takes political will and it takes a lot of capital in order to develop. But a largest part is we need to ensure that we create those markets on the continent in order to eventually replace the traditional markets that we export to in terms of the global north. And reposition ourselves at least to produce some of the consumer goods and the smaller industrial goods that we consume locally. And I think that to me is a starting point that will eventually snowball into the Africa that we hope for.
I think the developing world is not asking for much. We are only asking for fairness, fair trade on even ground with fair trade agreements so that we can sell what we produce and get what we don't have fairly, not be stuck on this primary goods, being a primary goods producer. We also want to build these cars, but build these computers, so some kind of technology.
Look, I think the political principles get it and they try to argue. And I mean, this call from the Africa Financing Summit also has got a lot of pleas for advanced economies, private sector to work with African private sector, etc. The challenge is that and all these financing agreements which are made at a government level, that hardly translates into the multinational behavior of firms from these countries. So I think firstly, they can't force the firms from their countries to act in specific ways. And then there's the other thing that, multinational companies will always take advantage of their bargaining power and also take advantage of the fact that there's a complexity of jurisdictions that if you want to actively restrict their actions to abide by the law or be sustainable in terms of development, you need to go through so much complexity that it's almost impossible to enforce any regulation at this point in terms of multinational firms, because they will have post office headquarters in countries that are lenient, and they'll have operations in countries that have got major requirements, and always, escape back to whatever position puts them into power. And so there's the fact that, the modern form of capital has seen a separation between state and capital, at least in comparison to the colonial period, right? The colonial period was clear that it was the Queen who was commissioning the expedition of all these, whether it's the Dutch East India Company, whether it's Columbus, it was always the clear cooperation between state and capital. In the modern form of capitalism, obviously, there is this cooperation at a policy level. However, in terms of their behavior now, multinationals are not necessarily going to follow the agreements and bargains that political principles are able to make amongst one another. So there will always be that shortcoming. Moving right along, the Sahel force is vital in fighting extremist groups in the Sahel and Central Africa region. This is a statement from the United Nations Security Council, the UNSC, which held a video conference to assess rising conflict in the Sahel region. Since January in particular, the Sahel region has seen a rise in extremely violent incidents and a worsening of intercommunal violence, which is too often exploited by armed groups. The joint force, first deployed in 2017 by the Group of Five for the Sahel, the G5 Sahel countries, which includes Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, were a vital part of the security response to extremist arms groups in the region. While the Joint Force, national troops, the French-led operation of Barkhane, and the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA, these UN acronyms are always a mouthful, has made strides in the fight against terrorism. But much still remains to be done, and the region's security and humanitarian situation remains dire. Strengthening the joint forces police component will be an important step towards improving oversight over military operations, as well as linking them to state development, human rights compliance, and justice sector reform efforts.
Intercommunal violence. Please tell us more about this intercommunal violence. What differentiates it from other forms of violence? You also mentioned armed groups. So can you give us a little bit more detail?
Sure. So, okay, intercommunal violence is a form of violence that's perpetuated across an ethnic group or a community. So it's communities or ethnic groups fighting one another. And the violent parties feel solidarity for their respective groups, and the victims are chosen based on their group membership. So the Rwandan genocide of 1994 between Hutu and Tutsi is an example of intercommunal violence. This differs slightly from violence of armed groups, which, for example, is perpetuated by armed groups against civilians or communities. You're thinking here the Boko Harams, the Al-Shabaab linked terrorist groups in East Africa. So these are that is what differentiates intercommunal violence from armed group violence. In that, the intercommunal violence is outright violence based on either, say, religious background or religious grouping or ethnic grouping, whilst, armed group violence is basically the subjugation of communities, under the violence of a specific group. So that's how different. That's how the two are different.
Good.
Okay. Our next.
We need to silence the guns anyhow.
Definitely. We've been talking about that in Africa for a long time, and I'm concerned that in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen quite a strong increase in violent conflict across the continent, and it seems as though the new epicenter of terrorism and extremism is becoming Africa now, moving away from the Middle East. The United Nations Security Council held an open debate to address the root cause of conflict while promoting post-pandemic recovery in Africa, precisely what we've been discussing. The violent extremist groups in West and Central Africa and Mozambique, including those associated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, has continued and increased their heinous attacks on civilians, creating additional major challenges for societies and governments. The United Nations is advocating everywhere for a coordinated global effort on vaccines and for measures to alleviate the debt burden that threatens to cripple the recovery in many low and middle income developing countries, and in particular in Africa. Despite having suffered some of the COVID-19 pandemic's worst socioeconomic impacts, including inflated debt burdens, job losses, and worsening conflicts, Africa to date has received just 2% of vaccine doses produced globally.
Someone needs to put a stop to all of this. I mean, we have Al-Qaeda in North Africa, Libya. We have Al-Qaeda now in Central Africa, and we have them in Southern Africa, and we also have them in West Africa.
In fact, all of Africa. You have just counted all of Africa in all the regions you've mentioned. It's not a laughing matter. We may be laughing, but it's a very, very serious concern. And, the big concern now is that with the big divergence, as we're seeing in terms of the global response to COVID-19 pandemic, that things will get worse as, the scramble for resources and as people feel the pinch of the humanitarian crisis caused by displacement and the conflict, matters and deaths are definitely going to continue. On the other hand, though, I'm sure people in the DRC and other parts of the continent will look at us and say, this has always been the case in Africa. Conflict has never escaped certain places, despite the fact that other regions are able to operate, and in some instances the rest of the country is able to operate in the context of ongoing violence. There are places on the continent where violence has never left, and it's just getting worse and spreading right now, which is a big concern. Linked then again to our last story on Niger and Mali.
I hope there's no more violence. We end on a good note this time.
Unfortunately, that hope will not be realized today, as our last story is on Nigeriens internally displaced after Mali attacks. So more than 10,000 men, women and children have fled their homes in Niger's western region of Tillabéri since last Friday, on the 14th of May 2021. This follows violent attacks by non-state armed groups in the Anzourou district near the border with Mali. In recent months, the Tillabéri and Tahoua regions along the border with Mali and Burkina Faso have experienced escalating cross-border attacks. The number of internally displaced persons in Tillabéri has nearly doubled over the past year and a half, from 57,000 in December 2019 to 102,000 in May 2021. Across Niger, 2.3 million people are likely to be severely food insecure during this year's lean season because of insecurity, drought, and floods.
Wow. Okay, I hope the international aid agencies rush in there and do some work.
Yes, and I think, the challenge of the conflict also makes the humanitarian response difficult or almost impossible. And I think, if we are to deal with these two problems, earlier on we were talking about, the challenge of industrializing Africa and moving away from our dependence on commodity exports towards exporting manufactured goods. We only have so much that we can supply globally. Obviously, there's a lot of competition, but that can be resolved by slowly increasing intra-Africa trade and also slowly substituting what we import by locally produced goods. In terms of the conflict, it seems as though a military and a humanitarian response is really the only way forward, because it's the humanitarian crisis that is the result of the conflict, which ends up being also exploited by combatant and armed groups to further their conflict interests. And so it seems as though unless we're able to deal both with the conflict decisively, and that needs a military response, as well as the humanitarian crisis, we're never really going to resolve the conflict or the problem of conflict in Africa. And it's become very clear now that a large part of the conflicts in Africa are directly linked to our infrastructure and development deficit. And that for the most part, we've always blamed the conflict as constraining development, and that's true. But it seems as though it is a bi-directional causality, in that the conflict, yes, does destroy physical infrastructure and destroys the accumulation of capital, but at the same time, it's the fact that we have such a low base in terms of local investment, and also part of the reason why we cannot rely exclusively on local capital for development is because we have such a low base of industrial capacity and infrastructure development in the first place. And then so conflicts about access to resources become very escalated very quickly, or become very exacerbated very fast, because they not only become about access to living resources, they now become about access to patronage networks, about access to control of the state, in order to at least take care of yourself, because the national governments aren't able to roll out infrastructure that reaches everyone in the country, or we've got weak states that cannot provide social security for everyone. And so we're always faced with the issue of the humanitarian and developmental crisis leading to conflict, and the conflict leading to further humanitarian crisis, and the two feeding off of each other, which is
a non-ending cycle which keeps on reinforcing itself. Yeah.
And on that note, that brings an end to our show for this week.
Thanks a lot.
Africa.